Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode on Brian Epstein from the book The Man Who Made the Beatles, Brian went into the family business after having tried out acting and having to go into the army for a little while. Brian was in a relationship with a female for 2 years until he broke it off with her, saying that it wasn't going to work. Brian then learned about the Mersey music scene that was going on at the time from a magazine that he agreed to sell in his store. It was entitled The Mersey Beat. And that's when he first heard about the Beatles. He got his assistant to go with him to the cavern, and he saw the Beatles live and in person. And that gave him the idea of managing them. So let's see what happens today. A major figure on the Mersey scene at the time was Bob Wohler. He was the 29-year-old former railway clerk and the club's resident disc jockey. His manner on stage was authoritative, and his knowledge of pop, especially the local ones, was encyclopedic. He introduced the Beatles on stage 274 times. Like hundreds of local pop fans, Wohler wondered about Brian, the boss of NIMS, and his sudden interest in the Beatles. He was more intrigued when he saw Brian come several times in unannounced with a staff member of NIMS named Rita Harris. Brian also knew of two staff members, Rita Shaw and John Banks, about their opinions of the cavern and the Beatles. 4 weeks after his first visit, Brian returned to the cavern alone, and he was carrying a briefcase. He stayed long enough to listen to the Beatles and confirm his first judgment. He made his way through the crowd to the stage, and he managed to get a brief message across to George Harrison that he would like to see the group at his NIMS office later, and perhaps he could help them. John Lennon was wary, and he asked Bob Wohler if he would go with him to NIMS. John wanted to get Bob's opinion of Brian. Bob was like a father figure to hundreds of Liverpool musicians, and he agreed to go with them. He said to John, "Well, okay, I'll come down. We got to be suspicious of all these people." So Wednesday, December 3rd, 1961, Lennon, Harrison, McCartney, and Best first went for drinks at the Bridge Pub with Bob Wohler. They wondered how could a record shop owner advance their careers. Then they walked across Whitechapel to NIMS. Epstein was busy working alone on Christmas orders, and he unlocked the door to let them in. He had been waiting at the counter on the ground floor among the refrigerators and washing machines to see when they arrived. The pop department in the basement was their regular place for listening to the latest American pop records. Now they were summoned to the shop by its boss. Epstein now vaguely identified them as the uncouth youths who would loiter in his basement for too long. Rita Shaw said that they used to drive us crackers, wanting the way out American music. 3 Beatle members were late at the 4:30 meeting, and this irritated the punctual Epstein. Paul was missing. He went home to have a bath, and he was 30 minutes late. And there was apprehension on both sides. Lennon broke the ice because Brian was wondering who Bob Wohler was, and John said, "This is me dad," and this made Brian smile slightly. They talked about different things. Brian told them about the speedy sales of My Bonnie, and he asked if they had a manager, and they said no. Most of the talking was done by Pete Best, surprisingly, and then Brian admitted that he had no experience, but he wanted to look into their affairs. The Beatles stayed noncommittal. After 10 minutes of polite exchanges, Brian said shyly, "Well, I would like to meet you again," and the Beatles just said they would go away and think about his idea. Brian wanted to meet without Wohler, but Wohler had talked to Epstein, and he didn't tell him that the Beatles were looking for a manager. When Brian asked how they were running their affairs, they said the name Alan Williams, and he got them work in Hamburg and promoted them on the Mersey side. Williams was a sharp-tongued promoter with an intuitive eye on the commerciality of rock and roll. He was the Beatles' manager for almost a year, up to the spring of 1961. The Beatles and Williams got into a squabble about a commission that Williams said was due him. It was for their residency at the Hamburg Top 10 Club that autumn. He decided the Beatles were unreliable. Brian turned up at Alan's Blue Angel Club one night and introduced himself at the reception desk. Williams didn't know him, but he knew him by his professional reputation at NIMS and by his byline in the Mersey Beat. Brian said to Alan, "I hope you don't mind me asking you, Alan, for a bit of help. I'm thinking of managing the Beatles." Williams wasn't that surprised. His reaction was, "They're a fantastic group, but they'll let you down. My advice is don't touch them with a effing barge pole." They have a track record of being late, especially Paul McCartney. That struck a chord in Brian because on his first meeting with the Beatles, Paul was late. Epstein, though, said that they had not let him down yet, and Brian said to Alan he valued his opinion. And Williams emphasized his conviction that the Beatles were untrustworthy. Brian was troubled by that because unreliability was a trait he loathed. Williams told Brian they were ruthless, and when it comes to contracts, be careful of what you're signing. Make sure you can get out anytime you want. And Alan thought he could see that Brian was fixated on the Beatles and nothing was going to stop him. Next, Brian went to a friend and a neighbor of the Epstein family, Rex Mencken. He was the family lawyer, and his office was next door to Nim's. In 1961, Brian went to see him, and he wanted to have an unbreakable contract with a shattering group who was going to be absolutely unique in the world. Mencken told Brian that there's no such thing as an unbreakable contract. Mencken didn't draw up the contract. He didn't want the responsibility. He said, if you trust them and they trust you, then it's fine. If they don't trust you, well then, you've had it, mate. Brian then called David Harris, another lawyer and friend of the family, particularly of his brother Clive. Harris was 26, and he was the assistant solicitor in the law firm of Silverman Livermore. Harris said that he and Brian weren't friends. Harris said that even then there was nobody in Liverpool quite like Brian. He didn't seem to have any close friends. He was artistic and not part of the young bourgeois Jewish community in which we moved. He may have well despised us. We were all academics, intellectual snobs, and proud of going to the university. Epstein spoke to Harris on what he wanted for the contract. He wanted to be perceived as treating the Beatles fairly, not taking advantage of them. He was worried if he was charging them too much, and he was concerned that their parents or guardians should be involved or that they should consult their own lawyers. He knew they came from different backgrounds, and he wanted to demonstrate honesty and good faith. Brian wanted the contract drawn up before Christmas in 1961. It was a 5-year period, but the Beatles or Epstein could each end the agreement by giving the other side 3 months' notice. It was fair. So Brian took 10% of the Beatles' income, up to £1,500 a year. Then if they each earn more than $1,500 a year, Brian's percentage went up to 20%. The contract cost Brian a mere £15. It was Brian's job to get the Beatles' work, to guide and advise them in all their professional matters, to employ subjects in any part of the world, to undertake all necessary advertising and publicity for the artist. Brian was to advise the artist on all matters concerning clothes, makeup, and the presentation and construction of the artist's acts. That was important to Brian. And Brian used etiquette in dealing with the parents or guardians, getting the Beatles to sign the contract. Brian met the parents in their homes, and he persuaded the families he would do the utmost to elevate the group and to treat them fairly. Paul's widower father, Jim, was impressed by Brian's clear sincerity and businesslike determination. He remembered learning how to play the piano on a second-hand instrument he had bought from Nim's at Walton Road. Queenie and Harry welcomed Mr. McCartney to Queen's Drive and got along perfectly. Lennon's Aunt Mimi clung to a new hope that her errant nephew might now have some prospects after squandering his years at grammar school and art college in favor of a guitar. When Brian visited John's house, he arrived with chocolates or a potted plant for Aunt Mimi, who, noting he was an established and successful Jewish businessman, declared him nice and bright. Brian talked to the families, discussing talking tactics. Brian and John talked of a master plan. At that early stage, Lennon didn't oppose the sanitation of the Beatles' image. Epstein was able to convince him that it was all to their advantage to hoist themselves out of Liverpool to national exposure. Epstein was concerned for their security, and they were earning 75 shillings each for the every cavern session, higher than the normal rate, because they could pull in the audience. The Beatles were having financial struggles. Brian thought they seemed to be rudderless, and despite their parents' friendly encouragement, he was aware the Beatles were finding it hard to justify spending so much time in rock and roll, which offered them an unpredictable future. To show how serious he was about being their manager, Brian went to Frank Hesse's instrument shop. He learned from the manager that the Beatles' debts on hire purchases payments totaled a massive £200. Epstein settled the debt with a personal check, so Lennon had ownership of his precious Hofner Club 40 guitar, Harrison possession of his Futurama guitar, and amplification equipment for McCartney. December 10th, Brian had the Beatles meet him in his office to prepare for the signing. Alistair Taylor was there too. There wasn't a contract to sign yet. He said the contract would soon be ready. He told them what was involved and what percentages he proposed to take, and how much he hoped that they would all be successful together and reach the top. John Lennon was just as anxious as Brian to sign the contract, and he said, "Right then, Brian, manage us. Where's the contract? I'll sign it." Paul McCartney asked for confirmation that the relationship wouldn't affect their music. Then he said, "I hope we make it as a group, but I'll tell you now, Mr. Epstein, I'm going to be a star anyway." Sounds like Paul was full of self-confidence in his abilities even at that young age. The formal signing of the contract on January 24th, 1962, took place not at Brian's office, but in a 14-room Victorian house at 8 Hyman's Green. It was at Pete Best's house. The Beatles had built up a coffee bar basement club called the Casbah, and it was run by Pete's mother, Mona. The 4 Beatles signed the contract, and Alistair Taylor signed as a witness, but Brian did not sign that first document. Later, after the Beatles left, Taylor felt exposed, having been asked by Epstein to witness his signature, which wasn't there. Alistair asked him why, and he said, "Well, if they ever want to tear it up, they can hold me, but I can't hold them." When Alan heard about it, he figured that Epstein had wisely acted on his warning. If anything went wrong, he had the route out of their association which Williams had urged him to guarantee himself. He could have walked away at any time, Williams points out, and that had been my advice to him. So in an asterisk, it was noted that a second management contract running for 5 years was drawn up for October 1st, 1962, and this time Epstein did sign it. NIMS expanded to 9 Liverpool record shops, boasting a total stock of 500,000 records. Brian took his responsibilities seriously, but he kept thinking of the Beatles and how to get them out of their treadmill of club work. Since Brian ran a record store, they expected immediate action. The Beatles knew they were good, and now they wanted money and national fame. Brian felt the pressure, and all his waking hours were spent on the challenge he had created for himself. Beaver Radio, the hi-fi and record shop just a few doors from NIMS, sales representatives went in and told Walter Beaver, "I don't know what the hell Brian Epstein's playing at. We can't do any business with him nowadays because he's fooling around with these idiots." Brian had formed the Liverpool branch of the Gramophone Record Retailers Association, attracting nearly 100 national record dealers to an inaugural meeting of NIMS one Sunday afternoon, but his mind wasn't there. Beavers remembers Brian's father got very annoyed. He said it's disgraceful the way he's carrying on with these yobos. Beaver told Brian that Brian's family wasn't very pleased with him, and Brian said, "I don't know what they're moaning about. At least he keeps me out of mischief 2 days a week." Beaver said that Brian's family and everybody in the trade thought the fellow was mad, and they thought he was going to ruin the business and ruin himself. It took a lot of time before they were all proud of the fact that he had created something out of nothing. Beaver, as a competitor, saw Brian grasping the record business very quickly. His musical knowledge was excellent, but the downfall of it was that he overbought drastically. The only place to buy singles was NIMS. They had every single, and some in large quantities. They finished up with hundreds and thousands of completely unsaleable singles. It was their expansiveness, though, that gave Brian and NIMS a golden reputation. Brian wanted to show that the Beatles could break the rule that said show business had to emanate from London. The Beatles became Brian's alter ego, and to the Beatles, Brian was the best possible chance of a successful route out of Liverpool. They wanted to be professional musicians, and they found each other. So I'm going to stop the video here. In this episode, we had the Beatles and Brian meeting and them signing a contract. They were both a bit wary of each other, but Brian and the Beatles decided to trust each other and try to find success. Brian's family thought that Brian had gone crazy because he wasn't focusing much on his job with NIMS and was more on the Beatles and how to get them out of the club scene. It's neat to learn how Brian did business at NIMS, and then to hear about a fellow businessman who sold records too, and his thoughts on Brian and his business decisions. So I look forward to seeing how Brian gets the Beatles into the spotlight outside of Liverpool. It should be very interesting. I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I apologize for my voice. I seem to be having sinus issues, I think. Hopefully it'll go away soon. And once more, I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that I thought you might be interested in. If you click on the link, it takes you to the Amazon page. And if you want to purchase anything, I get a small commission that is of no extra cost to you. I want to wish everybody a good day and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.